You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we are joined today by Kerrie Dorban, author of Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer tells her story. It is a fascinating book, and we are so thrilled to have you on the podcast. Kerrie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Start by telling us a little bit about your professional background, because you've got a heck of one.
Thank you. I think that my background as a criminal defense attorney really it complements my true crime writing career very well. I was a criminal defense attorney for about 25 years, and I at one time specialized in capital litigation. So I really knew the ins and outs of death penalty litigation, had many clients some were serial killers, some were other, but so I really felt like I knew that world and I was well versed in that language and in that kind of pathology. And so that was really my background before going into true crime. But I started in poetry, of all things. So I spent a lot of years studying poetry and trying to do the creative writing professor route. And then the recession hit and I wound up going into criminal work. So it was a very weirdly circuitous way of getting into the true crime arena. But as is often the case where people wind up writing true crime, they have something in their history that leads them into that arena. In my foray into first writing about outlaw motorcycle gangs and undercover investigations, I was also very well versed in that, because at the time I was married to an undercover detective. And my background, I grew up with parents who were covert operatives in the CIA. So I really I was very well poised to be in the world of true crime. And by the way, they're retired, so I'm allowed to talk about it.
You're not outing them at this moment.
I am not outing them, no. They've already outed themselves. But it's an interesting path, and I think it really marries well with what I got into and why I can really speak to that and write about those worlds.
So what actually caught your attention in this rather amazing story of Dr. Lynne Fenton and her work with James Holmes, the Aurora mass shooter?
Aurora is a fascinating case on so many levels. I think at the time that Aurora happened, and of course the anniversary of Aurora was just this past July, it was the mass shooting that occurred at a Colorado movie theater on July 20th of 2012, just to remind the listeners, where James Holmes walked into a movie theater and massacred 12 people and injured 72 others. And what was striking about his story is that he, at the time, was the only mass shooter to have deliberately survived his shooting. He did this ostensibly so that people could study his brain. So whether that's arrogance or sheer curiosity, who knows? But that was really the impetus behind him doing this and plotting it and methodically going about putting the whole thing together. Partly the fascination. The other extraordinary thing about this case is that Dr. Fenton continues to be the only psychiatrist in the history of psychiatrists who has ever been publicly outed as the treating psychiatrist of a mass shooter. So we had an inside view of what it was like to treat a mass shooter before he commits this heinous crime. And so that was well worth delving deeply into that to find out what insights can we learn from that. That's really the big question. Why? Why does this happen? Why is this now an epidemic in our country? And how can we stop it? And so that was really the premise behind the book. How do you spot and stop a mass shooter? the really sad response to that is you can't stop one, but you can spot one perhaps with different criteria. So that on those levels, it was really a fascinating book and a fascinating study of criminal pathology. And fascinating too, that you have it from a psychiatrist who has taken an oath to do no harm and really advanced this kind of extraordinary statement, really. It wasn't a theory, it was a statement that she believed James Holmes was evil and not mentally ill. And that's really quite a powerful statement for a psychiatrist to make.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more, if you would, about how Dr. Fenton was outed, because this is so unusual. Yeah. Usually doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists remain in the background and their treatment is confidential. How did this happen?
So this was an extraordinary moment in her career. She learned, there's a lot that led up to it, but she had 6 sessions with James Holmes. And the whole time that she's meeting him and treating him, she has no idea that he is amassing an arsenal. And I should mention that James Holmes was a doctoral student in the neurosciences program at one of the most prestigious universities in the country. He was under the tutelage of many of the most prestigious professors in the country. And Dr. Fenton herself was highly qualified in the top 1% of her profession. So she was really the cream of the crop. So you have just the perfect storm there. So she's outed when Holmes's defense attorney puts her name in a motion to the judge, and that is never done. And there was some speculation as I was writing this, whether or not that was a deliberate act on the part of the defense lawyer to maybe steer the attention away from Holmes and put it on Dr. Fenton, because that's certainly, everybody wants someone to blame. Everyone wants a place to put their rage. And so she was a perfect target and put her name in the motion, and the rest was history, because as soon as everybody found out her name was outed, her life was in danger. She received death threats and the university had to really hide her. She left the state at one point. She had to wear a disguise. She had to wear a bulletproof vest, and her whole life turned upside down as a result of one attorney's motion.
Yeah, the passage where she's talking about being fitted for a bulletproof vest just sent chills down my spine. I felt so awful for this poor woman who she just went through hell. Talk a little bit about the media coverage and the effect that had on Dr. Fenton's life and work. It was absolutely horrific what the media did to her.
Yeah, so I should mention Dr. Fenton's life prior to this. She was a very well-respected, very reserved psychiatrist. She was not somebody that would go around. She was not on social media. She took her work very seriously, and being a psychiatrist was her second medical degree, which is really extraordinary. She went back to medical school because she believed so strongly in mental health. Got a second degree, a second residency. So she was really quite an extraordinary psychiatrist to begin with. And so when she got outed, the media just hounded her to the point where she was getting calls from every media station in the country. Almost on a daily basis, she would get hang-up calls and reporters that would stake out her house. She couldn't even go back to her house for quite a long period of time. She had to get special security. She had people following her, trailing her, just wanting to get a statement. At one point, she had somebody kind of dress or disguise himself as a homeless person sitting across the street from her, trying to get a statement from her. So her whole life was upended by this. And she wound up going into hiding for a little bit. And then when she decided she had to resign from her position as the head of student mental health because she couldn't be in the public eye. She thought she would be a danger to her students at one point. So she just really, her whole career was on the lurch. And in addition to all the media attention, she also had probably the specter of being sued for malpractice, being sued by victims' families, being sued by the Holmes family, any number of people coming out of the woodwork. So for 3 years, she was really first of all, she was under a gag order by the judge. So she couldn't even talk about her experiences or what she did to try to prevent or at least thwart some kind of attack. She had gone above and beyond what a psychiatrist or any professional would have done. And yet she was still targeted as let's go lynch her. That's really what it was, the mob mentality to make somebody pay for this heinous crime. And she was that poster child for it. So it took her a very long time to not only, if you can imagine, it's bad enough that the victims' families relive this nightmare every day. They have such a profound loss, such a hole in their life that they cannot, in many respects, cannot recover. You've got Dr. Fenton, who is in a different category, even though I would argue she was also a victim and a target of this, but she's put apart from it and has to endure this in silence. And she spends, it's almost a daily barrage from her own attorneys, from the university, where she is interrogated over and over again. These 6 sessions become her life for 3 years and beyond. So that, if you want to talk about the ripple effect, that is also a ripple effect of this crime, is that she is hostage to these sessions with Holmes. That's all she can think about, talk about, see. She continues to relive his presence. And so that was a fascinating and very disturbing piece of this story that I don't think a lot of people realize until they read the book or really get into that mindset.
You cover other mass shooters in the book, including the Columbine school shooters, Virginia Tech, and Newtown, Connecticut, which is right close to where I live now, to name some of the most notorious ones. And then you also mentioned some other lesser-known school shooters. Do you feel like there are characteristics that all of these troubled individuals have in common?
There are definitely commonalities, but it's impossible to spot a mass shooter. And that's the rub of it. I wish there was a checklist. If you see X, Y, and Z, then you know they're going to become a mass shooter. And so therefore you take them out of the population, or you remove them, or you get them help. But unfortunately, there really isn't. The common denominator really among all of them is that they are males. They're between the ages of 18 and 25. James Holmes was 24. Cho was, I forget what age he was, but he was a college student. You have that in common. But what was surprising to me when I was researching these mass shootings was that many of these mass shooters came from really like bucking the stereotype here. They came from good families, oftentimes families that were intact, families that care about them. You're not going to, in 90% of these cases, you're not going to see these mass shooters in the mental health system. So that's another really interesting misnomer. People think they're in. Holmes happened to be seen by Dr. Fenton, but really just by pure luck. I mean, he was referred to a social worker by his professors because as a component to his neurosciences program, he had to give presentations. He had to explain to classmates what was happening. And he really couldn't do it. It was almost debilitating. So the professors thought this must be some kind of anxiety disorder. So they sent him to a social worker on campus to say, maybe you could help him or give him something or help him so he can graduate. And so it was the social worker who had the foresight to say, this guy needs some help. We need to keep him in the system. And what was really striking about Holmes is he didn't exhibit any of the characteristics that somebody might exhibit if they were very nervous or stressed out about a presentation. He wasn't like that at all. In fact, he was described as being very robotic and mechanical and almost like a system in a sense to be studied, which is really unusual and strange. So again, would you even know? He's described as odd for sure. He looked odd, his mannerisms were odd, but would you ever target him as a mass shooter? Probably not. Cho, the mass shooter of Virginia Tech. Now it's an interesting situation too. Here he is in creative writing classes. So how do you distinguish between somebody who's being quote unquote creative and artistic and out there versus somebody who might become a mass killer? And then you have his professor saying, we didn't know, we really couldn't distinguish the difference. He was odd, he was strange, he wasn't in the mental health care system, although later on they discovered he had some mental health history, but it wasn't somebody that would have been obvious other than he was weird and off-putting and students didn't like him. And so they had that in common. So it's very difficult to pinpoint any type of checklist. Now, I will say this. What I did discover, and what I think is corroborated by the cases and the evidence, is that many, if not most, have some type of writing that they do, something that they will do or leave behind to memorialize their intent. And so that, I would say, if people encounter that, to pay attention to it. Holmes had a notebook that he wrote everything down. And of course, nobody saw this notebook until after the fact, but it was an artifact that was there. Cho had all of his writings, his plays and his poems that were very disturbing. Many others had manifestos. Some would post things on social media that were disturbing. Other people had videos that they posted, but in some way or fashion, they want to have their work recognized or acknowledged, which is a commonality. But again, just a word of caution, it's hard to know. How do you distinguish between the ones who are posting things and not going to become mass shooters and the ones that post things and record things and write things and become mass shooters? There really isn't a rhyme or reason to it. And that's what's really striking and frustrating. People want to put some kind of tag on it, saying maybe if they're in the maybe we need better mental health care system, maybe we need better gun control. But it's unfortunately, there isn't one thing that people can point to say, if we had done XYZ, this wouldn't have happened.
And as a teacher who goes into a high school every single day, I clearly do have a vested interest in, is there something we should be looking for? Here recently, earlier in the month of January, we had a 6-year-old shooter at a school here in Virginia. At that point, it's like, what do you even say to that? You've done enough research at this point. Can you speculate in any way about what might make a child that young resort to gun violence, or is it just as inexplicable to you as it is to the rest of us?
Again, it is inexplicable. I think the youngest case that we had in Arizona, it was a 7-year-old, I believe, who murdered his stepdad because the stepdad was molesting him. Now there you can see a connection, there's something going on there, but still it's disturbing, it's chilling, and there again, people want to say, what is that linchpin? Do we blame the parents? Do we blame the school? And really every case is different. And I don't know that that's really fair to put that on the parents, because in many of these cases, Columbine is a great example, parents didn't know. They had absolutely no idea. From looking at it from the outside, you would never guess that those two individuals were going to go in and terrorize the high school. So it is really disturbing, and it's very disturbing that the mass shooters are getting younger. And I wish I could even say that another commonality would have been that they're looking for places where they're public domains where they can have mass casualties and good escape routes in place. Those were certainly the case in James Holmes' situation. He actually went through that whole calculus. He deliberately didn't choose an airport because too much security and he might have gotten caught, and his whole objective was to stay alive. So he chose a movie theater because it had huge potential for mass casualties, and he called it a kill box. People literally sitting in there like sitting ducks. And so it's just disturbing on so many levels. And I think probably the most disturbing thing for me in writing the book is that there wasn't a concrete answer. There wasn't a way to answer that question, which Holmes himself poses in his notebook. He has a 35-page notebook, and 5 pages of it are devoted to one question: why? And that word gets bigger and bigger as the pages turn. And so it's really haunting and terrifying on so many levels. I will say there are some things that can be done to maybe not spot the killers, but to at least not be sitting ducks. We've seen countless horrors of people just taken off guard, surprised, unable to act, waiting for police to take action. And when in so many of these cases, the police are going to be too late. These shootings happen so quickly, the casualties are so huge, so what do you do? And so there have actually been suggestions, and I think that this might be implemented in one school, maybe more now, where I think the first thing that people have to realize is that we're living in this world now. We can't suppose or imagine that it's going to be a different kind of world. We have to accept the fact that this is happening. Students are arming and going into schools and slaughtering people. And that's a reality, as horrible and horrific as it is. So one of the ways to thwart that is to not take a stance where you're just waiting. You're just sitting there waiting for somebody else to take action. So how do you get into the kids' minds that maybe one person can be taken down? So one of the suggestions that was made that was a little controversial was to have a basket of rocks in each classroom where students could grab the rocks and just start pummeling the mass shooter coming in. And so it was a way to be proactive and to arm them, quote unquote, arm them with something that would be able to stop somebody. People are coming up with with suggestions. And I think they're worth at least discussing and having that continuing conversation of what can we do? How can we change this mindset that this is a reality? And like it or not, we have to now be proactive.
I'm not opposed to a box of rocks, not at all, but is that one step away from insisting that every teacher in every American school be armed? Or do you feel like that's a big leap from the box of rocks to insisting that teachers carry firearms as if they're in law enforcement, when we actually should be hiring them for their ability to inspire and educate our kids?
I think there are many steps that can be taken before you reach that extreme. And I think that some of those are starting to be implemented, if not really seriously considered. A lot of colleges now, for example, you can't access the building unless you have a lanyard with your ID on it that has a scan code. The doors automatically lock behind them. They scan and they're getting into the buildings. And of course, this wouldn't stop Cho, for example, Virginia Tech, but, it might stop Uvalde shooter, for example. So there are people that this could help. So that's one thing to implement. Another is to have doors that are self-locking, cameras outside that you can see the whole campus or the whole area. But then again, we're limiting that to the school shooters. And Holmes, of course, wasn't a school shooter. But so what do you do with these very big, wide open spaces that just scream, come get me? So how do you bar that? People are starting to take those measures. There's metal detectors at concert venues. People can't take in person. There are precautions that are taken. They're taken at airports. They're taken at concert venues. They need to be taken in schools, in my opinion. And so I just think that it starts with a conversation that we're living in a different world. And this is the reality. And we need to take those extra preventative measures to try to help. And arming a teacher, I think that's in the future. But I think there are steps we can take that kind of lead up to that. And I think the basket of rocks at least empowers students and children to say, okay, I can do something about it. I don't have to sit here and wait and hope that some major miscommunication in the police department doesn't happen and somebody's coming to the rescue. And so I think that these are very important conversations. They're controversial. They're tugging at the heart of who's in charge and who's going to take charge. And so, I think it's a difficult book, but it's one of the reasons that I really wanted to write this book. I wanted that conversation to keep going.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
And the sad thing is, when I wrote the book, I didn't think that we were going to have so many more mass shootings that were coming down the pipe. But now what's happening now is there are so many that it's almost as if people are becoming desensitized. And I think one of the reasons that I deliberately wrote Aurora in such a graphic way, I had to really think about who's going to read this book. Many of the survivors said something interesting, which I actually really agree with. And they said, you cannot dumb this down. You can't dilute this. You can't use euphemisms or sugarcoat it. This is what happened. And it's graphic and brutal and horrifying. And if people don't have these images front row center, they're going to forget. They're going to get desensitized. And so I made a very conscious decision to make it realistic. Not sensational, but realistic. One of the extraordinary things about this was that the judge, I think, had a similar viewpoint. He wanted this trial to be public. He wanted people to be able to sit in and hear the survivors and see the case. And it was really striking to watch it. And I will say that it was a chance really for first responders, for example, to get their story out, because they also are part of this ripple effect in this community where they oftentimes are not heard. Their voices are silenced. They do this extraordinary work. They're traumatized from it, and they don't have a voice. They don't have a platform to say, hey, this is what happens to people like us. And in the Aurora case, what happened and what was really even compounding the tragedy was that the first responders were the police officers. They were coming to the theater, not knowing what they were going to face. just seeing the scene that many have described as worse than a battle scene. It was absolutely horrific. And one of the details that really struck me was they walk into this movie theater and it is just a slaughter. But what they see on the ground are all of the phones from the victims, from people that have fled out of the theater, from the people that were killed. Their phones are lighting up from all the loved ones that are trying to reach them. And that's a very eerie scene, if you think about it, because it's like this, it's so symbolic. People can't reach them. It's the cry for help. But that's what the first responders really faced. And they had to get these people out of a movie theater that is already so contained and difficult to get out of. And they couldn't wait. And that's, again, like just the extraordinary courage of the police officers who were in that theater and just responded. They're not allowed to transport victims in their patrol cars to hospitals, but they did that in this case, because they knew if they didn't, these people would lose their lives. So they really were heroes or are heroes. And I think their story is told through Aurora, and it needs to be echoed, because it's really, nobody hears that. Nobody talks about that. And nobody talks about the survivors, the people that, lived through that, but weren't killed and are dealing with all kinds of tragedy. And I mean, from being a defense attorney and having defended people like Holmes, it was also a very interesting experience for me to be able to write this and say, oh my God, how many times have I felt the way Holmes lawyers must have felt? That you're appointed to represent these really the worst of the worst. I'll say you're appointed to represent them. You have a job to do. You have to ensure that they get a fair trial. And yet, where do you put all of that trauma? That's the thing that I think people they don't realize it. And so I think this book really gave me an opportunity to really address that from not only a personal perspective, but this is what happens. These cases, it can be so easy, especially as a lawyer, to be given so many cases and they start to become rote, where you really stop and think about, wait a second, each one of these cases, each one of these people that I represented had families like the victims and survivors of Holmes. And it's worth taking a pause and saying, okay, what's really going on here? And so it was very interesting from that perspective too.
It's a very good book. I told you that off air before we started, but it was a brutal book and it was very hard for me to read. And by the time I was done with it, I had to go read Pride and Prejudice for a little bit to kind of act it as a palate cleanser. But definitely the most brutal but most necessary parts of it are the ones that you just outlined: the trial, the first responders, the survivors. I had to stop a couple of times and go get tissues because it is very moving and affecting. And this isn't the sort of narrative that you get to see when you're reading books about other mass shooters like Columbine, for example, from Dave Cullen. It is a very different kind of book, but boy, it was a rough read for me. But I applaud you for being able to spend this much time with that material. How did you deal with living with this? This is tough.
Yeah, it was very, very tough. It took me 4 years to write it. And I think it definitely affected me. I also had to walk away several times. I would cry during many of the scenes writing, especially the trial scenes. I was very moved. And it would take me a while to decompress and say, okay, I'm writing about real people. These are their lives. I can walk away and come back to it and create it, but they're living with it 24/7. And it's just so striking. And I remember really even feeling for Holmes's mom and the moms of the Columbine shooters, and feeling, wow, this is like a horrific thing to contend with on so many levels. The ripple effect is so far reaching. And I think that is really where the mental health community can come in and really do some good service because that's where we need it. So I think for me, there was a lot of decompressing, going and watching comedy when I needed to, or going on hikes or doing what I need to do to get out of it, because it was horrific. And and the other thing about it is it's not an easy book to put down and then come back to. So when I was in it, I was in it. And I had to watch the 24 hours of interviews with Holmes, for example. And it was very different for me than dealing on a case, like a law case. because I really was coming at it from a completely different perspective and trying to understand it from the harm that this one individual did and the arrogance or audacity that he had to say, I want people to study my brain. It's like, to what end? To what end? Yeah. Because really, and Dr. Fenton, she and I became good friends. Her life has been destroyed. It's never been the same. And I think it's one of those things where it's not even that you rebuild your life. It's that you're starting like, this is the new normal. Like, this is what it is. I'm not okay. It's not okay to be not okay, but this is the new normal and we've got to press through it. And I think that was a very sobering realization as well, that I heard many times before even starting writing this book, that grief had a cycle, right? The 5 stages of grief. And I don't actually believe that. After writing this book, I don't think there are stages. I don't think that people get over things, and I don't think that they should get over things. I think they just find another path, another way through in order to get through. And that I really gained a whole new insight and respect for it, because it was very difficult.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I don't think I've ever heard anyone articulate the fact that this 5 stages of grief is a complete crock. And the only people that I know that talk that way haven't suffered this kind of profound loss. Yeah. And Kristin and I have both been touched by homicide, which is how we met. We push back quite a bit on Mind Over Murder of this ridiculous idea of closure. There is no closure. There's never going to be any closure. I've talked to all of the other Colonial Parkway Murders families. None of them feel like there's been an ounce of closure. Now, maybe someday we'll have a person or persons to identify and perhaps focus some of our rage. But beyond that, there is no closure. There's the before and the after. And I've talked to Kristin about this before. This type of event changes your life from that moment forward forever. And you're never getting your old life back, much in the same way you're not ever getting your loved ones back. It's over and done, and your life will be forever changed. I'm not saying you won't have moments of joy. I'm not saying there won't be some times in your life when you will feel great happiness again, but it's never going to be the same. I've never heard anybody, counselor, say the 5 stages of grief really maybe aren't quite so legit.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting point.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to talk about it for what it is. I'm very much a realist, and I think that I don't think it's very helpful to sugarcoat things or deny things, because it's a raw, real emotion. And I definitely, maybe because I've experienced it myself, I can speak to that point, but I think I think, again, it's one of those things people have a hard time talking about, hard time articulating, so they gloss it over. But I don't think it can be glossed over, should be glossed over, because I think that does a disservice to not only the person who's suffering, but also the memories that you're trying to keep intact. It's a very tough process, and it made even tougher when it's a life taken by a killer.
When you have a community like Aurora or Columbine, or really any community that's been touched by this kind of violence, it clearly does change the community. You've mentioned ripple effects a couple of times. What should communities who suffered from a mass shooting event like this do to help heal it? But I say heal it with the quotation marks around it, because you can't really. But what can communities do to come back together after such a tragedy?
I think it's really important to acknowledge the tragedy and to be a support system for each other. And that doesn't necessarily mean reminding each other every minute that this has happened. It just means really just being present for your neighbors, your community, understanding, acknowledging that, so that people don't become or don't have this feeling that they're a pariah in their own community. And I think that's unfortunately a common, after effect of tragedy, where a lot of people don't quite know how to approach People that have gone through this, and so they back off. Then, unfortunately, that just further isolates the people that have gone through it. So I think as a community, it's really important to be united and to kind of come together, acknowledge that this tragedy happened in your community. Don't ever forget it. Just be a constant support. I know that here's an example, the jurors, for example, in Holmes' case, stayed in touch. They went through something too. So, and that's interesting too, because you don't really hear about that very often, unless they're interviewed on 48 hours, but you don't really hear what impact it had on the jurors. And they are a community in and of themselves because they've sat through this and they've sat in judgment.
Yes.
And that's really difficult to do. And then in Holmes' case, oh my God, like one holdout juror who didn't vote for Dad. Imagine how that juror feels. So I think it's just important to acknowledge that everybody has come together from a place of horror, but that you can come together and make something new and good out of that. And that's really hard to do, but I think it's essential.
I was very interested in one of the minor rabbit holes that you discussed in the book is the idea about whether violent video games and media leads to violent behavior. Because I know that one of the things Holmes was doing was playing a lot of first-person shooter games, and we have seen with other mass shooters. What are your thoughts on that? Do violent media and violent video games lead to violent behavior?
I don't think that has actually been proven. I think that the consensus is that if you are already wired that way, that you're going to do whatever it is that you're going to do. And I don't think that there's certainly plenty of what I call quote unquote normal, stable children, teens who love to play video games and love to enter into that other world. And I don't personally understand it, but I think there is a sense of being able to be an avatar, for example, or be another person, this whole second life idea, be in that other world and not have any responsibilities or any repercussions that you would in this world. And I think that the consensus is that the majority of people can identify or distinguish that difference, that you're in that world for that period of time, but that is not this world, the real world. And the people that can't distinguish that, there are so many factors, so many things that are going to trigger them to become the mass shooter. And because we can't identify any one single factor, certainly somebody like Holmes, who already is fantasizing about killing people and has had this fantasy from day one, and in fact comes up with a human capital theory where he believes people have points and values. Certainly, maybe that could have been fostered further by video games, but really he had that philosophy and that theory before he ever touched a video game. So it is interesting, but it's definitely a study and a comparison that continues to be studied. There's not a definitive link necessarily, at least in the research that I have found.
Does the experience of researching and writing the book, does that change your perspective as an attorney? For instance, would you take on a case now defending a mass shooter, let's just say?
That's a really interesting question. And I actually no longer represent criminal defendants, and I don't do capital work anymore. And I actually made the decision to not do capital work before I embarked on Aurora. It had such an effect on my own view of the world that I couldn't do it after a while. And I applaud the people that can do it. And I did it for 15 years. And I just one day came to the conclusion that I don't have the will anymore to do this. And because I couldn't do it, I had to step down because I'm not going to do a service to my client if I feel this way. But doing Holmes certainly solidified that feeling that I just can't do this work. I believe in the Constitution. I believe everybody deserves a fair trial, but I had seen too much and I just couldn't do it. And I recognized that kind of later on in my career as I was reaching the end of it, where I thought, I don't have that feeling that a lot of these people over here do. And I'm fighting, they're really bad people and they've done some really horrific things. And even though I believe there's mitigation and there's rehabilitation, I really have come to the conclusion after Holmes that I don't know how much I believe in that. And I don't know how much that, and I know the big thing is it's not to excuse a person's behavior, it's to mitigate their sentence. But I don't believe that anymore. And so it really did affect the way I approached cases. And I had to step down from criminal work for that reason. And it's interesting because I should mention this. I actually started as a prosecutor. So I started my law career as a prosecutor, and I did prosecution for 5 years. And then I switched over and did defense work and wound up in capital litigation for a very long time. And so it's just interesting to flip-flop back and forth. Where I'm like, it's good to see both perspectives. And I'm really grateful that I have both perspectives. But I think because I am in a position where I can choose now, I'm choosing not to do the criminal defendants.
And if I pressed you on this, do you feel like Dr. Fenton that this particular defendant is evil?
I actually do. And it was really interesting because when I started this project, I really didn't have an opinion one way or the other. And I thought, I'm approaching this from a very objective point of view, and I'm going to interview people, I'm going to do the research. But from what I have researched and know of Holmes, I really do think that hypothesis has a lot of support. And this is the interesting PS to this. I did my thesis on the idea of whether or not there were people that were born evil, like the double Y chromosome.
Oh, wow.
And I just find it so fascinating that it's come full circle and I have this project because at the time it was very controversial and there wasn't a lot of evidence. But I really do see how Dr. Fenton came up with that belief. And I really do think there's a lot of support in this particular case for it. And I know that's a really controversial stance and it's a horrifying stance. There is certain pathology, and I would say antisocial personality disorders, aka psychopaths who really cannot be cured. And they really are those people that are born evil, in my opinion. So I think those are the chilling, oftentimes, the Ted Bundys, the people that just charm the pants off people. But Holmes was a category in and of himself, I believe. He certainly wasn't charming. He was one of those individuals that almost defied a diagnosis. Psychiatrists that came on board to diagnose him were having a difficult time figuring out what was actually wrong with him. And so I think that Dr. Fenton nailed it.
So after embarking on what had to have been an absolutely horrifying and difficult book, what is your next project? Are you going to try to top this, or is this sort of it?
Back to poetry, maybe?
Yeah, back to poetry.
No, it's actually another dark topic. Yeah, I'm actually just in the very early stages of now, but it's dark and it's probably going down the foray of more pathology, psychopathic pathology. So it's very interesting, very dark. And I'm very superstitious. So as soon as I sell it, I can talk about it. But it's another true crime, and I'm very excited about it. It's an area that I feel like it's definitely in my wheelhouse, and I'm really interested in writing it. And I also think it will have a huge impact in another arena, another domestic violence and that kind of arena that I think also needs a lot of discussion on.
Now I'm intrigued, and we're going to have you come back and talk about it as soon as you can.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm very excited about it.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. The book is Aurora, the psychiatrist who treated the movie theater killer tells her story, by Dr. Lynne Fenton and Kerrie Dorban. Kerrie, thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.